Nora stands in the shadows of a frozen Chicago alley, the bitter winter wind whipping against her oversized olive green coat. Her world is a blur of overdue rent and exhaustion, until she sees him, a boy in a crisp school uniform, deathly pale against the red brick. She drops to her knees, her nursing instincts screaming against the silence. She finds the sleek smartphone in his pocket and presses the contact labeled Dad with trembling fingers. "I found him," she whispers, her voice a fragile thread in the dark. She has no idea she just summoned a man who treats the city like his private chessboard, and life like a blood sport. Nora, a nursing student with red and raw fingers from a grueling shift, utilizes her training to identify Rosario's severe hypoglycemic shock. The man on the other end of the line, Benedetto Cesare, responds with a voice hard as steel, warning her that any move could be her last. Exactly 8 minutes later, a black SUV glides to the curb with perfect synchronization. Benedetto emerges, a man in a custom-tailored suit with tattoos creeping up his neck and the radiating authority of a king. As he saves his son, his laser-like gaze catalogs Nora's worn coat and her stubborn dignity, realizing she isn't just a bystander, she is a potential queen in a world of pawns. The snow continued to fall in heavy, silent flakes, dusting Rosario's Navy school blazer and Nora's trembling hands. Every few seconds she checked the boy's pulse, her nursing instincts fighting against the paralyzing cold of the Chicago alley. Then the silence was shattered. The low, predatory growl of a high-performance engine vibrated through the pavement before the vehicle even turned the corner. A matte black SUV swung into the narrow space with terrifying precision, its headlights cutting through the dark like twin blades of light. Nora shielded her eyes, her heart hammering against her ribs as the passenger door opened. Benedetto Chaser didn't just step out of the car, he commanded the very air around it. He was a vision of dark, tailored elegance that felt dangerously out of place amidst the grime and slush. Even from a distance, Nora could see the intricate black ink of a serpent's tail curling up from beneath his crisp white collar, disappearing into the sharp line of his jaw. His eyes, dark and piercing, scanned the scene with the cold efficiency of a man used to assessing threats. "Move back," he commanded. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that felt like a physical weight. Nora didn't flinch. "He's in hypoglycemic shock," she snapped, her voice surprisingly steady despite her shivering frame. "If you move him without stabilizing him, he'll seize. I've already rubbed some glucose gel from my kit into his gums, but he needs a professional IV, now." Benedetto froze. He looked down at the girl in the oversized, threadbare olive coat, then at his son, whose breathing was finally leveling out. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the devil slipped, revealing a raw, jagged edge of paternal terror. He knelt in the snow, heedless of his expensive trousers, and placed a tattooed hand over Nora's smaller one. His skin was searingly hot against her frozen fingers. "You stayed," he murmured, his gaze locking onto hers. The intensity was overwhelming, a magnetic pull that felt both like a promise and a warning. Up close, he smelled of expensive tobacco, cedarwood, and something metallic that Nora couldn't quite name. "I couldn't leave him," she whispered. Benedetto's eyes tracked the red and raw state of her hands, then moved to the fierce determination in her dark eyes. He saw the poverty in her clothes, but the wealth in her spirit. Behind him, 2 large men in suits stood like stone pillars, waiting for a signal to intervene, but Benedetto waved them back. He reached into his coat and pulled out a clean silk handkerchief, wrapping it gently around Nora's bleeding knuckles where she had scrapped them on the brick. "The world I live in is full of people who only move for a price," Benedetto said, his voice dropping to a private, dangerous whisper. "But you moved for mercy." He stood up, effortlessly lifting his son into his arms as the back door of the SUV was flung open. He paused at the door, looking back at Nora, who stood alone in the swirling white abyss. "The debt for a son's life is infinite, Nora Daler. Consider yourself under the protection of the devil now." As the SUV sped away, leaving Nora alone in the quiet alley, the warmth where he had touched her hand remained, a burning brand that told her her life would never be the same again. The following morning, the world outside Nora's cramped apartment felt muted, as if the heavy snow had swallowed the city's noise. The silence was broken by a rhythmic, heavy thudding at her door. When she opened it, she didn't find her landlord with an eviction notice, but a man who looked like he had been carved from granite, holding a sleek black envelope. "Mr. Cesare is expecting you," was all he said. An hour later, Nora was ushered into a study that breathed of old money and dark secrets. The walls were lined with leather-bound books, and the air smelled of cold rain and expensive espresso. Benedetto was standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, his back to her. Even without the suit jacket, his presence was stifling. The white silk of his shirt strained against his shoulders, the ink on his neck dark and defiant against his skin. "He won't eat," Benedetto said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to pulse in Nora's chest. He turned slowly, his gaze heavy and unreadable. "My medical staff, men with decades of experience, tried to approach him this morning. Rosario threw a tray at them. He keeps asking for the woman from the alley." Nora shifted, her hands hidden in the pockets of her worn coat. "He's scared, Mr. Cesare. Trauma doesn't care about the pedigree of a doctor." Benedetto crossed the room, his movements fluid and predatory. He stopped just inches from her, close enough for Nora to feel the heat radiating from his body. He held out a thick document. "I don't just need a nurse, I need a ghost. Someone who lives within these walls, monitors his condition around the clock, and remains invisible to the world outside." Nora's eyes skimmed the first page of the contract. The number at the bottom of the salary line made her breath hitch. It was more money than she would have earned in 5 years at the diner, enough to bury her debts and secure her future 10 times over. "This is a lot of money for a nursing student," she whispered, her heart racing. "It is a high price for your freedom," Benedetto countered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate level. He leaned in, his dark eyes searching hers. "If you sign this, you belong to the Cesare household. My enemies will become yours. My shadow will become your only shelter. It is a deal with the devil, Nora. I will not lie to you about that." Nora looked at the pen he held out, a heavy, silver instrument that felt like a scepter. She thought of Rosario's pale face in the snow, and the strange magnetic pull of the man standing before her. She wasn't just signing for the money. She was signing for the feeling of being protected by the most dangerous man in the city. With a steady hand, she took the pen and traced her name onto the parchment. As the ink dried, Benedetto's fingers brushed hers, a brief, searing contact that felt like a seal. "Welcome home, Nora," he murmured, his eyes flashing with a dark, triumphant spark. "Let's go see my son." The transition from her drafty apartment to the Cesare estate felt less like a move and more like an abduction into another dimension. The fortress sat atop a cliff, a sprawling monolith of cold stone and reinforced glass that overlooked the city like a silent predator. As the iron gates hissed shut behind the SUV, Nora felt the final chord to her old life snap. Inside, the air was filtered and perfectly still. A woman with a face like porcelain and eyes that saw everything led Nora to a suite that was larger than her entire building. "Mr. Cesare has provided everything you might require," the woman said, gesturing to the walk-in closet. Nora stepped inside and felt a pang of vertigo. Gone was her salt-stained Sherpa coat and the worn nursing scrubs that had been her second skin. In their place hung rows of silk, cashmere, and lace, an armory of elegance. She ran her fingers over a deep emerald evening gown, the fabric cool and liquid against her rough skin. These weren't just clothes, they were a uniform. By accepting them, she was shedding the struggling student and becoming something else, a ward of the underworld. After a long, hot bath in a tub carved from a single block of black marble, Nora dressed in a simple but impossibly soft charcoal sweater and slacks. She began her rounds, weaving through the labyrinthine hallways towards Rosario's wing. Every 20 paces, she encountered a man in a sharp suit, their hands folded in front of them, their gazes neutral but unwavering. They didn't look at her like a guest. They looked at her like an asset that needed guarding. She found Rosario in a room filled with high-tech monitors and windows that didn't open. He looked smaller here, dwarfed by the opulence. "Does the sun ever reach this part of the house?" Nora asked, checking his vitals with practice ease. "Only when Dad lets it," the boy replied, his voice tinged with a bitterness that made him sound decades older. Nora looked toward the window. The glass was thick, likely bulletproof, and the balcony was patrolled by silent shadows. She realized then that the velvet ropes of this life were just as restrictive as the iron bars of a cell. A shadow darkened the doorway, and Nora didn't need to turn to know it was Benedetto. The air in the room seemed to tighten, humming with the electricity that followed him. He had changed into a dark navy suit, the unbuttoned collar revealing the dark ink of the serpent's tail on his throat. He watched her work, his expression unreadable. though his eyes lingered on the way the expensive fabric now draped over her frame. "Does the cage suit you, Nora?" he asked, his voice a low, melodic rumble. "It's beautiful," she said, finally meeting his gaze, her chin lifted with that stubborn dignity he had noted in the alley. "But even a golden cage is still a cage, Mr. Cesare." "In this city, the only alternative to a cage is a grave," he countered, stepping closer until she could smell the cedarwood on his skin. "Stay inside the steel, Nora. It's the only place I can keep you safe." The digital clock on the wall glowed a ghostly neon blue, marking 3 in the morning. The mansion was a tomb of silence, save for the hum of the climate control and the distant rhythmic footsteps of guards in the corridor. Nora moved like a shadow into Rosario's room, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. The boy was deep in sleep, his breathing steady, but the sensor on Nora's handheld monitor had chirped a warning. His levels were dipping. As she reached for his hand to perform a manual break, she realized she wasn't alone. Benedetto was sitting in a high-backed velvet chair in the corner of the room, half submerged in darkness. He hadn't changed. He was still in his dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and etched with dark, intricate ink. A single amber glass sat on the table beside him, untouched. "He looks peaceful," Benedetto whispered. The roughness was gone from his voice, replaced by a weary hollow that made Nora's heart ache. "He's stable," Nora replied softly, clicking the lancet. She worked with a delicate, reverential efficiency. "His body is just adjusting to the new regimen. Go to sleep, Benedetto. I'm here." He stood up, his massive frame unfurling like a panther's. He didn't leave. Instead, he walked over to the bed, standing on the opposite side of Nora. The small bedside lamp cast a warm, golden glow between them, illuminating the sharp planes of his face and the exhaustion in his eyes. "I haven't slept through the night since his mother died," he confessed. It was a staggering admission of weakness from a man whose name was used to frighten the city into submission. "I close my eyes and I see the alley. I see him pale and silent. And then I see you." He reached across the bed, his hand hovering over the sheets before his fingers brushed against Nora's. This time the contact wasn't a seal or a command. It was a plea. His skin was unnervingly warm, and for a moment the role shifted. She wasn't the employee, and he wasn't the boss. They were just two souls tethered by a child's fragile life. "Why did you stay that night?" he asked, his gaze searching her with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. "You knew who I was. You saw the cars, the guns. Most people run from the devil." "I didn't see a devil," Nora whispered, her breath hitching as his thumb traced the back of her hand. "I saw a father who was losing his world, and I know what it's like to have nothing left to lose." Benedetto leaned forward, the scent of cedar and expensive bourbon wrapping around her. For a heartbeat, the space between them vanished, charged with a heavy, magnetic heat. He looked at her mouth, then back to her eyes, a raw, unspoken hunger flickering in the dark. "You are a dangerous woman, Nora Daler," he murmured, his voice a low, jagged caress. "Because you make me want to be a man who deserts your mercy." He pulled back just as the monitor gave a soft, reassuring beep. The moment broke, but the spark remained, smoldering in the quiet room. He turned to leave, but at the door he paused. "Sleep when you're finished. That's an order from the father, not the boss." The following week, the fragile peace of the mansion shattered in the dead of a Tuesday night. It didn't start with a medical monitor or a soft confession, but with the heavy, rhythmic thrum of low-flying helicopters and the screech of tires on the gravel driveway. Nora woke instantly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Instinctively, she ran towards Rosario's room, but the corridor was a sea of motion. Men in tactical gear, faces obscured by masks, moved with lethal efficiency, their weapons held at low eddy. She found Rosario sitting up in bed, his eyes wide, but his face set in a hauntingly familiar mask of stoicism. "It's a hit," he whispered, sounding far too accustomed to the term. "Someone tried to intercept a shipment at the docks." Nora didn't have time to process the boy's words before the double doors at the end of the wing swung open. She expected a medic or a bodyguard. Instead, she saw the devil. Benedetto stumbled into the light of the hallway, supported by 2 of his lieutenants. The tailored navy suit she had admired days ago was ruined, the silk torn and soaked through with a dark, visceral crimson. He wasn't just injured, he was drenched in it. The copper tang of fresh blood hit Nora's senses before she could even reach him, thick and cloying in the filtered air of the fortress. "Nora," he rasped, His voice a jagged edge of pain and adrenaline. "Get the boy to the safe room." "You're bleeding," she said, her nursing training overriding the sheer terror of the scene. She stepped toward him, but her foot slipped on the slick marble floor. Looking down, she saw the trail of red he was leaving behind, a map of a violent struggle that had nothing to do with contracts or designer gowns. As she reached out to steady him, her hands came away stained. This wasn't the abstract blood of a textbook. This was the reality of the Caesarea Empire. She looked at his face and saw a cold, terrifying detachment in his eyes, the look of a man who had just taken lives to protect his own. The serpent tattoo on his neck seemed to writhe against the backdrop of the gore. "This is the business, Nora," he said, his breath hitching as he leaned his weight against the wall. He looked at his stained palms, his gaze flickering with a momentary flash of regret before hardening into steel. "This is the man you signed the contract with, not the father in the chair. This." The gothic romance of the past few days vanished, replaced by the grim, unvarnished truth of the underworld. Nora looked from her bloodied fingers to the man she was beginning to trust, realizing that the protection he offered was built on a foundation of bone and lead. She didn't run, but the air between them grew cold. She had stepped into the devil's shadow, and now she finally understood that in his world, even the silk was dyed in red.
The transformation was complete when Nora looked into the full-length mirror. The emerald silk gown she had touched days ago now clung to her body like a second skin, its deep hue contrasting sharply with the warmth of her complexion. Around her neck sat a collar of diamonds that felt less like jewelry and more like a high-end leash. She was no longer the girl in the olive green coat. She was a masterpiece curated by the underworld. Benedetto appeared behind her, his reflection striking and lethal. He wore a tuxedo that seemed to absorb the light, his white shirt crisp against the dark ink that climbed his throat. He didn't say she looked beautiful. Instead, he placed his heavy, warm hands on her shoulders and leaned in until his lips brushed her ear. "Tonight, the city will try to read you like a map," he murmured, his voice a low vibration. "They will look for the fear in your eyes to find the cracks in mine. Give them nothing but ice, Nora." The gala was held in a ballroom of gold leaf and crystal, a sea of predatory elegance where every smile was a masked threat. As they entered, the room didn't just go quiet. It seemed to tilt on its axis. Benedetto didn't lead her. He marched her into the center of the fray, his hand anchored firmly at the small of her back. It was a claim, visceral and absolute. "Is this the one, Benedetto?" A voice cut through the hum of the crowd. Michael Donovan, a man with a smile as sharp as a razor, stepped forward. His eyes didn't linger on the diamonds. They bored into Nora's, searching for the clinical detachment she used as a shield. "The little bird who flew into the devil's nest? She is the one who keeps my world turning," Benedetto replied, his voice dropping into that dangerous, melodic register. He pulled Nora closer, his thumb tracing a possessive line against her ribs. "And the one whose safety is non-negotiable." Nora felt the weight of 100 gazes. Across the room, rival bosses whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes narrow and calculating. She realized with a jolt of terror that Benedetto hadn't just introduced her to society, he had painted a target on her back. By claiming her so publicly, he had revealed his only soft spot. To these men, she wasn't a person, she was leverage. During a tense dance, as the violins wailed a haunting melody, Nora looked up at Benedetto's steeled expression. "You've made me a pawn," she whispered. "No," he countered, his dark eyes flashing with a fierce, protective fire as he spun her through the shadows of the dance floor. "Don't look away, Nora. Let them see that the devil has finally found his match." As the song ended, Nora caught Donovan's lingering stare, a cold, predatory promise that the war had moved from the docks to the woman in the emerald dress. The illusion of the gilded cage shattered 48 hours after the gala. Nora was in the medical wing, adjusting Rosario's insulin pump, when the burner phone she had kept from her old life began to vibrate with a frantic, jagged rhythm. A heavy signet ring she recognized from the gala gripped the woman's shoulder. There was no sound, only the sight of the old woman's trembling lips and the cold, flat eyes of Michael Donovan's lead enforcer staring into the camera. "Nora?" She hadn't heard Benedetto enter. He moved toward her, his presence usually a source of heat, but as he saw the screen, his face turned to a mask of glacial stone. He took the phone from her shaking hands, his jaw tightening until the muscles corded like iron. "They went for the neighbor," she whispered, her voice breaking. "She has nothing to do with this. She's an innocent woman, Benedetto." Benedetto didn't look away from the screen. The guilt in his eyes was a dark, roiling tide. He had spent his life believing he could control the collateral damage of his world, but by claiming Nora, he had led the wolves directly to her heart. He had replaced her threadbare coat with silk, but he hadn't told her the silk was a target. "Donovan isn't looking for a ransom," Benedetto said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "He's looking for a debt. He wants to see if I'll burn my empire to save a ghost from your past." He turned to her, his large hands framing her face. The tattoos on his fingers felt like brands against her skin. "I did this," he murmured, a raw, jagged vulnerability breaking through his authority. "I brought you into the light, and now the shadows are hunting you. I thought I could keep you behind the steel, but the steel has failed." "We have to save her," Nora pleaded, her fingers curling into the lapels of his suit. "You said you were the devil. You said you were the most dangerous man in this city. Prove it." Benedetto leaned his forehead against hers, a silent, heavy promise passing between them. The air in the room grew thick with the scent of impending violence. He wasn't the father in the chair or the lover in the dark. He was the boss, and the blood debt had just been called in. "Get your coat, Nora," he commanded, his eyes flashing with a lethal, unholy fire. "We're going to get her back, and I'm going to show Donovan why men pray they never see my face in the dark." The warehouse at the edge of the shipping district smelled of stagnant water and old grease, a hollow shell of industry that now served as a stage for a bloodbath. Nora's old olive green coat felt heavy on her shoulders, a relic of her past life that grounded her as she followed the black-clad shadows of Benedetto's elite guard. Beside her, Benedetto moved with a terrifying, silent grace, a suppressed submachine gun held low, his eyes fixed on the flickering light at the end of the corridor. "Stay behind me," he breathed, the command vibrating with a desperate need to protect. "I'm not here to hide, Benedetto," Nora whispered back, her voice lacking even a tremor. "I'm here to finish this." They burst into the central chamber just as Michael Donovan's lead enforcer raised a pistol toward the chair where Mrs. Patel sat bound and weeping. The air exploded with the deafening rhythm of gunfire and the shatter of glass. Benedetto's men moved with surgical precision, a wall of lead that forced the syndicate hitmen into the shadows. In the chaos, Nora saw her opening. She didn't have a gun, but she had the clinical detachment that had saved Rosario in the snow, a cold, focused clarity that cut through the noise. She sprinted across the open concrete, the hem of her coat snapping like a flag. A hitman stepped from behind a crate, blocking our path, his weapon leveling at her chest. Nora didn't flinch. She skidded to a halt inches from the barrel, her eyes locking onto his with a gaze so fierce it seemed to burn. "If you pull that trigger, you'll be dead before I hit the ground," she said, her voice dropping into a low, jagged register that mirrored Benedetto's. "Look at him. Look at the man behind me." The hitman's gaze flickered for a split second toward Benedetto, who was advancing like an unstoppable force of nature, his face a mask of unholy fury. In that moment of hesitation, Nora saw the man's hand shake. She reached out and gripped the hot barrel of the gun, pushing it aside with a strength born of pure, distilled fire. "You are in the devil's house now," she hissed, "and I am the only mercy you'll get tonight." Benedetto was there a heartbeat later, neutralizing the man with a brutal efficiency that left the hitman crumpled on the floor. He turned to Nora, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a mix of horror and profound realization. He saw the way she stood, shoulders square, chin lifted, her hands steady even as the smoke cleared. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a pawn. He reached out, his blood-stained thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I told you that you were a dangerous woman," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "I learned from the best." She finally let out a breath. As they moved together to untie Mrs. Patel, the hierarchy of their world shifted forever. Nora Daylor had faced the darkness and hadn't blinked. She had found the fire to match the devil's, and in the ruins of the warehouse, a queen had finally been born. The adrenaline that had sustained them through the warehouse raid ebbed away, replaced by a heavy, profound silence as the SUV glided through the iron gates of the estate. Mrs. Patel was safe in the private medical wing, and the city was quiet, unaware that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably tonight. Nora stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in the study, still wearing the old olive green coat. It was stained with oil and smoke, a stark contrast to the black marble and gold leaf of Benedetto's world. She watched the sunrise bleed across the Chicago skyline, a pale pink light that failed to warm the glass. "You're thinking about the exit," a voice rumbled from the shadows. Benedetto stood in the doorway. He had discarded his tactical vest and unbuttoned his shirt, the serpent tattoo on his throat stark against his pale skin. He didn't look like a boss or a devil. He looked like a man who had finally reached his breaking point. "The contract is fulfilled," Nora said quietly, though it felt like her heart was being carved out of her chest. "The threat is gone. Rosario is stable. You don't need a nurse anymore, Benedetto." He moved toward her, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He didn't stop until he was standing directly behind her, his heat radiating through the worn fabric of her coat. He reached out, his hands hovering over her shoulders before finally settling there, his grip possessive yet trembling. "You think this was about a nurse?" he asked, his voice a raw, jagged whisper. "You think I brought a woman who stares down hitmen into my home just to check a boy's blood sugar?" Nora turned in his arms, her breath hitching as she saw the look in his eyes. The devil was gone, replaced by a man who looked utterly terrified. "I have spent my life building walls, Nora," he murmured, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. "I thought the steel and the stone were what kept me alive, but tonight when I saw you standing in front of that gun, I realized that I haven't been breathing for years. I've just been surviving." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. The scent of cedar and gunpowder wrapped around them, the final traces of the night's violence. "Rosario loves you. He needs you. But that isn't why I'm asking you to stay." He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes, his gaze burning with a desperate, singular truth. "I can't go back to the silence, Nora. I can't go back to a world where you aren't the first thing I see in the light and the last thing I see in the dark. Stay. Not as a mercenary. Not as an employee. Stay because you are the only soul who ever walked into my shadow and brought the fire with her." Nora looked at the man who ruled the city with an iron fist, now waiting for her word with bated breath. She reached out, her fingers tangling in the dark hair at the nape of his neck, and pulled him down. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered against his lips. As the sun finally broke over the horizon, the golden cage was no longer a prison. It was a throne. And the devil had finally found his queen.